army out. The Romans found the Samnites exactly as Decius had described, in confused disarray, attacked them immediately, and won easily. The Romans had now won their first two engagements with the Samnites, but the first had been an unexpectedly hard slog, and the latter would have been a disaster had it not been for the tactical blunder the Samnites had committed by not immediately falling on Cossus's legions. The third and final battle of the war was fought at Susula, near the border between Campania and Samnium. Envoys from that city came to Marcus Corvus with news that the army he had driven off was regrouping and planning to reinvade. Corvus ordered his army forward with all haste, leaving behind all non-essential personnel and gear, marching only with his infantry, cavalry, and what could be carried on their backs. This decision to pack light would prove, unexpectedly, to be the decisive factor in the coming fight. When Corvus arrived at Susula, he ordered a camp built. Due to the paucity of men and material, the camp turned out to be physically much smaller than the Samnites were used to seeing the Romans build. They assumed this meant that a smaller force was encamped, and all their strategic decisions flowed from this faulty assumption. They decided that the best course would be to starve the small Roman garrison out and began preparing for a siege. The Samnite commanders, rather than keeping their army together, ordered foraging parties out across the countryside for supplies to sustain their army while they waited for the Romans to surrender. Corvus caught wind of the Samnite activities, and, as soon as the bulk of the army was scattered, he ordered his men to attack. The Samnites were shocked when the whole of the legions came pouring out of the small camp, not the minor detachment they had supposed they were dealing with. Corvus's army took the Samnite camp almost without a fight, and then spent the rest of the afternoon rounding up the dispersed Samnite foraging parties. The Battle of Susula was over before it had really begun. This victory marked the end of the First Samnite War. Corvus and Cossus were both awarded triumphs, and Decius was given the grass crown for his heroics. The grass crown was the most prestigious and rarely given military honor, the highest decoration a Roman soldier could receive. It was given to an individual who single-handedly, or nearly single-handedly, saved an entire legion from destruction. It was a rare honor because it was granted only by a vote of the saved legionnaires themselves, and it took extraordinary circumstances for proud Roman soldiers to admit that they had to be rescued. But in this case it was universally understood that Decius had saved their butts, so Decius got the grass crown. After the fighting ended, however, the Romans were forced to deal with trouble from an unexpected source, their own legions. During the winter of 342-341 BC, the legions were garrisoned across Campania to keep an eye out for further Samnite aggression. The largest garrison was outside of Capua, the city famous for its soft, easy living and detrimental effect on military discipline. Indeed, as we would later see, some note a marked change in the power and endurance of Hannibal's army after spending the winter in Capua during the Second Punic War. The Roman garrison, cooped up for the winter in camp, looked on at the comfortable Capuans and began asking themselves why a people who could not even defend themselves were allowed to have so much when they, the soldiers who had secured the peace, were given so little. The consuls for that year began to hear mutinous rumors coming from the Campanian legions and took steps to nip the conspiracy in the bud, but the move backfired. Their plan was to quietly reassign the men identified as conspirators and shuffle groups of soldiers around so no hard plans could be laid. But the conspirators quickly caught on, and, rather than reporting to their new assignments, they collected at an arranged point and began to actively plot a rebellion. They were soon strong enough numbers-wise, but lacked a leader to make them a cohesive unit. In a classic display of counterproductive ego and pride, nobody was willing to submit to the command of anyone else, so they remained a body without a head. As they brainstormed for ways out of their dilemma, it was noted that an ex-general, Titus Quintius, lived in the area. Quintius had retired fully from public life, despising the backstabbing intrigue of Roman politics, and the conspirators decided he was the perfect choice to lead them. A company of men was sent to persuade the old man to join their cause. Quintius, however, wanted nothing to do with the mutinous rabble, but was persuaded when the men threatened to kill him and his whole family if he did not come along. Having successfully hijacked a leader, the revolt moved forward, and the men marched towards Rome, though what exactly they hoped to accomplish is unclear. They probably wanted to secure land grants in Campania, but how they thought the Senate, or the people of Rome, would simply give them what they wanted and then go on as if nothing happened is a mystery. The rebellion had taken on an irrational inertia all its own. Upon hearing the news that a rebellious army was marching on Rome, the Senate immediately named Marcus Corvus the first of his two dictatorships, and he rode off at the head of a legion to stop at the Alban Mount, near the birthplace of Romulus and Remus, but neither side was destined to draw their swords in anger. Instead, the occasion was defined by reconciliation and secured Corvus's place in the history books not just as a great warrior, but also a wise and compassionate leader of men. He was loved not just by the men he led that day, but also by the mutineers, most of whom had fought with him against the Samnites. Corvus implored them to put down their swords and not draw the blood of their fellow citizens. Quintius, the hijacked general, who wanted no part of the rebellion anyway, ordered his men to stand down, and the combined weight of these two towering figures compelled them to give up. Corvus then led a combined force back into Rome, where he famously asked for and received clemency for the rebellious soldiers. Corvus did not want the affair to remain a thorn in the side of Roman solidarity, and he made sure no soldier was cast off the census rolls or in any other way penalized for his actions. It was a singular case of leniency toward mutinous soldiers, and, though Corvus was hailed forever as a great man for securing the leniency, his example was rarely followed by later generations, who treated any hint of mutiny quickly and without mercy. Soon after the abortive rebellion, a truce was formalized with the Samnites. The Campanians, however, were in no mood for peace, and allied themselves with a combined Latin army that took the fight into Samnium as a punitive response to the Samnite invasion of Campania. The Latin communities hoped to grab some Samnite land and enhance their own power in the region, hopefully securing better terms of alliance with Rome. The Samnites immediately appealed to the Romans to halt the attacks. The Romans agreed to order the Campanians, who were now their subjects, to halt, but claimed their treaty with the Latins granted them no authority over their own internal military decisions. And this decision had two effects. For one, it offended the Samnites, who thought the Romans were just hiding behind legalese and directing the Latins, subjects to Rome in all but name, to keep fighting illegally after the treaty had been established. Second, it perked the ears of the Latins, who took the Roman decision to mean that the Romans did not believe they could stop the Latins from what they were doing. The time was ripe, the Latins decided, to renegotiate their status with Rome. For over 100 years, they had sent men and money to fight Roman wars and were consistently given only a pittance of the spoils in return. Full equality, they decided, was theirs for the taking, and, turning away from the Samnites, they set their sights on Rome itself. Having just concluded one war, the Romans were about to be embroiled in another, the Latin War, which would not turn out exactly as the Latins planned, resulting in not full equality, but full subservience to Roman rule, and an end even to the appearance of independence. The First Samnite War would prove to be mere foreplay between the Samnites and Romans. The Romans had gotten the upper hand, but it could have just as easily gone the other way. The Second, or Great Samnite War, would start 20 years later and not last for 2 years, but 22 years. In that war, the Samnites would hand the Romans some of their greatest and most humiliating defeats. The Romans had, since their founding, used the Greek phalanx system for their army, but soon found it unsuited for the mountainous terrain of Samnium. The Samnite cavalry and light infantry were able to easily outmaneuver the heavy Roman phalanx, forcing the Romans to completely overhaul their military structure before they could beat the Samnites in the field. But that war was still a generation away. Next week, the Romans will follow the old adage that the enemy of my enemy is my friend and join forces with the Samnites to quash forever Latin dreams of independence. Welcome to the history of Rome. The outcome of the First Samnite War had been inconclusive. Yes, the Romans had gotten the better of it in battle, but nothing resembling a definitive conclusion was reached. The Samnites seemed content to consolidate their gains and not press the issue, and the Romans were disinclined to take the fight to the next level. They had done right by their allies and driven the Samnites out of Campania. They had no interest for now in invading Samnium and trying to conquer a strong-willed, capable, and well-supplied army. Plus, the winds of discontent were blowing in from Latium, and the Romans knew full well that if they got entangled with the Samnites, the Latin communities would be in a strong position to leverage concessions from the Romans. So a treaty of peace was concluded between the Romans and Samnites. The Latins saw this as a tacit admission of weakness and, seeking a more personally beneficial arrangement with the Romans, decided to strike while the iron was hot. But before any sort of conflict with the Latins were joined, a further step was taken in the plebeian, thanks to John for correcting my pronunciation, quest for a greater share in power. In 342 BC, not long after the mutiny of the garrison soldiers in Campania, the plebes pushed through another set of reforms that solidified their power. The package included the important provision that one of the consuls for each year not just could be a plebe, but had to be a plebe. But more importantly, it set the well-known and oft-cited requirement that 10 years must pass before a man could hold the same office twice. The move was designed, obviously, to prevent one man from gaining too much power, but at times the cure was worse than the disease, especially, for example, during the Second Punic War, when it became nearly impossible to run the war when the leadership kept changing. So though the 10-year requirement was followed and disregarded according to circumstance, it did set a cultural precedent strong enough that when, between 104 and 100 BC, Gaius Marius was elected consul 5 times in a row, it was a scandal that engendered enough ill will that the social fabric of the state began to unravel. But that is for a much later date, probably sometime early next year at the pace we're going. When the Romans withdrew from fighting the Samnites, the Campanians and Latins both wanted to carry on with the fight. As I mentioned last week, the Samnites implored the Romans to put a stop to the aggression, but the Romans refused to order the Latins to do anything one way or the other. But if Rome did not feel strong enough to enforce its will, politics being the zero-sum game that it is, then that meant the Latins must be stronger than their supposed masters. They resolved to use this to their advantage. A delegation representing the Latin League was sent to Rome to demand a political reordering. Up to this point, the Latins had enjoyed varying degrees of Roman citizenship, usually trade and intermarriage rights, stopping short of full suffrage. The delegation asked of the Romans not just full suffrage, but also audaciously demanded that one of the 2 yearly consuls come from the Latin communities. The Romans were shocked and practically laughed the delegation out of the Senate. No Roman was going to submit himself to the rule of the mere Latin. The plebes had just guaranteed their own consulship and weren't about to give it up, while the patricians had just given up one of their consulships and weren't about to let go of the other. On the question of a Latin consul, the 2 classes were united. The Senate's, and I'm paraphrasing here, answer to the Latin delegation was, no, there will be no political reordering. We like things just the way they are, thank you very much. Do you not remember that we wiped the floor with you at Lake Regillus, and that's why things are the way they are? If you really want what you're asking for, then come take it, if you can. The Senate then immediately voted for war to teach the impertinent Latins a lesson. Legions were raised and sent out to meet the Latin force that had been massing in anticipation of the Senate's rejection of Latin demands. The consuls for that year were Titus Manlius Torquatus and our old friend and hero of the First Samnite War, Publius Decius, he of the grass crown. On a brief tangent, the Romans dated the past by reference to the consuls for a given year, rather than by an arbitrary number.